So much that has been really interesting, exciting and important in international art happening in Australia has happened via John Kaldor. And now John has incredibly generously given his collection to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which is why Tony Bond, our Assistant Director Curatorial, is here, and they're going to talk about it. And I'm just going to leave them, and then they're going to talk to you.
Okay, what you're looking at, of course, is the process of the wrapping of Little Bay in 1969, which is where it all began. Incidentally, just to clarify things, the exhibition we've got on at the moment is an exhibition about the history of the projects from 69 to the present. And there are some works from John's collection and some works from our collection in it, but it's more of a kind of history show, more of an archival show. What happens in May 2011 is that we open a whole new wing of the gallery dedicated to John's collection. So for the first 9 months or so, and then we'll do a kind of combo across the whole floor, still with a very substantial component of John's collection. But that's a separate story. We'll rev up to that in a year or so. But this is about the projects. And in 1969, I just want to set the scene. It wasn't clear to me when I started to write for this rather magnificent book that Sophie Forbatz edited for John about the projects, just how singular and important John's projects had been. And it became clear to me subsequently that neither did John. You know, I just set the scene locally. 1969. There's no Australia Council, there's no Biennale of Sydney, there's no curator of contemporary art in any museum, there's no contemporary art space, no contemporary art museum. There's really a kind of an absence of infrastructure. Artists are doing things, there are individual curators around. I mean, Daniel Thomas obviously had an interest, but he was the curator of everything. This was a context in which 23-year-old? You?
No. When I first... Is this working?
Yes.
In 69, I was 33. I wish I was 23.
Oh, all right. I mean, he looks pretty young in the shots. But anyway, the young curator decides that what he wants to do, he had for some years been collecting art, since you were 23 probably.
That's correct.
That's correct, okay. But also sending Australian artists overseas with the scholarship he'd organised, our Corso Secca's scholarship to give Australian artists an opportunity to experience things overseas, sculptors in fact. But he decided in 69 it'd be really nice to reverse the story and to bring international contemporary practice here. And Christo was his choice for the first project. And I'll let him talk about how that happened and how that evolved. But just to put this into an international context, having done the local context, I realized, as I didn't until I started to write and look at the history, that this is one of the first major land art projects anywhere in the world. It's a couple of years before Spiral Jetty. It's way before Lightning Field. It's about a decade before the Deer Foundation set out to do something similar, several decades before Art Angel was set up. So here we were, an individual in Australia deciding that he was going to do this. And it really was a first. For Christo, it was a major first, his first major land art piece. And as you can see from that bit of film, it's not the sort of thing you'd even attempt to do today. It was just too dangerous, too big. You wouldn't get permission. You know, just not on. But, you know, John, how did you actually get it together?
Sheer luck and a bit of determination. But I didn't say, good evening, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming. Well, it all started quite innocently. As Tony said, for 3 consecutive years, we had a sculpture prize where we awarded, I can't remember how much now, for a young Australian sculptor to travel overseas. After three of the local sculpture scholarships, I thought it would be a good idea to bring somebody from overseas to have an exhibition here and maybe give a lecture. And I saw in some art magazine Christo's work at Documenta. It was like a hot air balloon, like a long sausage in Kassel, in one of the first Documentas. And the image I found really interesting. So that's when I also started to travel on business to New York, to London. And I walked into Leo Castelli's gallery. I hope you know who Leo Castelli was. He really founded pop art. He discovered Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Lichtenstein, Andy Warhol. I mean, he was really the godfather of the pop art movement. And again, in those days, I keep saying those days, contemporary art wasn't what it is today. There were very few galleries and very few people who collected it. So I went up to Leo Castelli and I asked, do you represent Christo? And he said, no, Christo doesn't work through galleries, but here's his phone number, you can ring him. So I left the gallery, and unfortunately on those times mobile phones weren't quite invented yet. So I went into the nearest phone booth and rang the Christos, and I spoke to Jean-Claude Christo and said, look, I'm a young man from Australia, I'd love to come and visit you. Moment's hesitation, and she said, well, I got about 15 minutes tomorrow around lunchtime. Come and see us in our loft. In those days, Soho was mainly a light industrial and warehouse area, Soho in New York, where artists moved in and lived illegally, as they had makeshift plumbing and other sanitary conditions. So I went to see them, and we really hit it off, and the 15 minutes turned into a few hours. And I invited them to come to Australia to make an exhibition and give lectures. And Christo and Jean-Claude said, look, we don't want to lecture, we don't want to give an exhibition, we want to wrap a piece of coastline. Well, I mean, it was quite a surprising statement, even in those days, but they were so charismatic that they convinced me that the most important thing I could do is find them a piece of coastline to wrap. So I came home, and I went systematically around the foreshores of Sydney. Now, in those days, I had long hair, I didn't have a beard, sometimes I wore beads, and my Hungarian accent was the same as it is now. And all the foreshores of Sydney was army, navy, or government. So I walked into, let's say, an army office, and I said I would like to borrow a piece of your coastline. I mean, literally, I had no connections, I was young, I was employed by a big company. And they said, well, what do you want to do with it, mate? I said, well, we want to put up a temporary sculpture. And they said, oh yeah, what kind of sculpture? Well, we want to wrap it. Well, they either laughed me out or threw me out. They said there's a place in Gladesville somewhere that you should go and see. You should go and see those people. But I persevered, encouraged by Christo and Jean-Claude, and I finished up at Little Bay Prince Henry Hospital, which on these days was an isolationist hospital for tropical diseases, and it was gated. And the administrator there, Dr. Clancy, said, it's an absolutely crazy idea, but if you pay for the insurance, if we can receive and charge a small admission to the grants which will go to the hospital, I think the nurses and doctors and patients might be amused by it. So we got permission. So really, That's how it started. And that was just the beginning, because we had to get it surveyed. And I mean, people were just quite incredulous. Through a connection, I got a surveyor who would do it free, and he surveyed it and did a very good job, gave me the survey and said, well, why do you actually want to survey it? I don't think you would get permission to have this developed. See, the chap who he worked for was a big developer. And I said, no, we're going to put up sculpture. Okay, again, what kind of sculpture? Well, it's actually going to be wrapped. He said, yeah, but if you wrap it, how are you going to send it away? True. And then we had to experiment with the materials, what was the right materials, what was the best way to fasten it. But it was all just experimentation, and we had no experts. We talked to whoever we could. I mean, if you compare it to today, 40 years later, Christo and Jean-Claude work with a most professional team of environmental experts, of a group of engineers, human resources. I mean, it's a proper machine. And that's the only way they can do projects like the gates in New York, which was a few years ago, or the projects before, the wrapping of the Reichstag or Pont Neuf in Paris, all their recent projects. But again, in those days, as Tony says, it was Christo and Jean-Claude's first major land-based project. There was hardly any money. We raised money through Christo selling drawings. The whole project cost less than $100,000, which today would be millions to realize. We had a lot of in-kind donations. Fabrics were donated to us at cost or below cost. We had a lot of student workers who came. And what is, in a way, part of the Australian art history now, that a lot of people who helped there had no intention of becoming artists, but they were so engulfed by Christo and Jean-Claude and by the whole project that they became artists. I mean, the best example is Iman Stillers, who was an architecture student, and not only an architecture student, but he received the gold medal for architecture from Sydney Uni, and yet after Christo he decided to become an artist. And to today, Christo, Jean-Claude and he are good friends. What else can I say about this project? Well, it changed my life, because once the project was finished, I thought, this is too good to be a one-off. See, I never intended to do a series of projects. My ambition, if you like, was just to make this one project happen. And I thought that would be quite satisfactory. But after that, I thought, no, this is too much fun and too important. Let's start another one, and then another one. So that's how the projects developed. Also, I was working for Dunlop, which is a big public company, no longer existed. And they didn't like the publicity that it received, because a lot of it was ridicule. And so Dunlop and I weren't very good friends. And I thought to myself, if I can organize the wrapping of a coastline, I can probably run a small business of my own. So in a way, it was Christo and Jean-Claude that gave me the courage to start my own business. And that was the beginning. So Tony, over to you.
Okay, and it went down, a lot of the projects went on to Melbourne and did something different there. Sheep bales in the old Murdoch Court, as it used to be. And then another inspired move, somewhat through the connection with Christo, because Christo actually did a wrapping for Harold Zeeman at the Kunsthalle in Bern, and knew that Zeeman was somebody who shared John's scope of ambition. Harold Zeeman, at that point, had just decided to move out of museums and galleries and actually become the first independent Uber curator, if you like. And he was somebody, the first person to take conceptual art, minimalism, and affiliated sort of territory, and actually put it in the public domain in a way that with exhibitions that made it clear for a broader public. It really was quite an exceptional time. Harold, of course, who went on subsequently to do 2 Venice Biennales, to do Documento and so on. But this stage, he was just branching out as a young independent curator. It was also the time when, for instance, the same year that Inhibitors was thinking about forming. So conceptual art was there, no support structure in the country for it still, no Australia Council, nothing like that. But John brings out Harold Zeman, who travels around the country, goes to artist studios. You can see him here, top left, with a very young Daniel Thomas looking at a completely empty collection store at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, because the Art Gallery was just building its Captain Cook wing, and we hadn't yet moved the collection into the Captain Cook store. Thanks to John, we're now stripping it all out again so we can turn it into the Kaldor Gallery. So there is a loop. The top right, you can see Harold talking to Peter Kennedy, a very young Mike Parr, Tim Johnson, an opera house which is still just a shell, Waters Gallery that hasn't changed at all in many ways. Anyway, so that's just a few shots, and going around the country, putting together shows in different cities with artists that sort of towards the conceptual end of the spectrum. So do you want to say anything more about that?
Well, Harold went on afterwards really to establish a most important career. He was curator of the Documenta, twice curator of the Venice Biennale. He was the one who introduced Chinese art to the West. He was the first, and there was a big Chinese section in his first Biennale. He was an exceptional man, and he really turned curating into an art.
Yeah, I think having him here in '71 was just, following on from Christo, was a real impetus to give courage to local people to try stuff out and move on. We didn't really have a public voice of the kind of Harold Zeman here at that point. So, through this sort of network of connections, I might say at this point that John had no preconceived agenda. He kind of followed what was interesting at the time. And when you look at the collection in a certain way, I am, being an art historian, tracing a certain pathway through the collection, but actually it's almost serendipitous. I'm finding a very performative streak running all the way through, which you can see a bit in the projects as well. But I think, that it was very much what interested him at the time, and it was not a program as such. Fair enough?
Absolutely, and still is.
Yep.
There is no, there's no abstract, if you like, thought behind it. It's just, I should have said that in the beginning, what my aim was, once I started to do projects, and what my aim is still today, is to bring to Australia groundbreaking artists who represent the latest and important trends in contemporary art, so that the local artist and art-loving public can see firsthand, and wherever possible, to meet those artists. See, I'd like to define our projects as we don't want to compete with galleries. We don't want to bring out exhibitions. That's the role of galleries. When we do a project, the artist always has to come out to be part of it. Most of the projects we do either in situations, in typical situations, or in situations and in galleries. If we go back the last few projects, it was Martin Boyce at the old Melbourne jail, Gregor Schneider, Bondi Beach, Urs Fischer, Cockatoo Island, Bill Viola in a beautiful old church in Redfern. By having the projects done in various environments, the artist is challenged to respond to those environments. And a bit of Australia becomes part of the project. And it's also then exported overseas. For example, we'll come to it, but Richard Long, who was here in '76, had this year a huge retrospective at the Tate, Britain, and the work he did in Australia in '76 was shown there. I mean, Christo's Wrapped Coast has been shown, I don't know how many different places internationally, and it's always Wrapped Coast that is being shown. Gregor Schneider on Bondi Beach, and Gregor came here in this room, he talked to some of the students. The beach cells were shown in Israel this year, and very likely will be shown in the United States next year, and it's referred to as the Bondi Beach cells. So it's not only bringing artists to Australia, it's taking Australia internationally, connecting it with the global art scene.
So these boys, relatively recently out of St Martin's Art School, John invited, and they did performances both in...
This is the way of living sculpture.
Now, Tony and I have been practicing, so Tony, will you join me on this table?
But I mean, these guys were quite extraordinary, and you know, they'd start at 5, I mean, sort of at opening time, and go through the day at the gallery, and went for 2 weeks in Sydney and then down to Melbourne for a couple of weeks. John's described them, I think, very nicely.
They were absolutely incredible. I met them through Christo and Jean-Claude. I asked them, can you suggest somebody to bring to Australia after Zeman? And Christo said, well, when we did the Belly Curtain in Colorado, there were these 2 young English artists. They're very different, but I hear they're good. Why don't you contact them? So next time I was in London, I contacted them, and they came to the hotel room. They walked in single file, wearing the same suit, same shirt, same tie, same shoe, and they sat down, very formal, very stiff, and they were the living sculptures. and they're still that way today. I see them every year when I'm in London, and we go to restaurants, and when they walk into a restaurant, single file, same suit, same shirt, same tie, same shirt, everybody just stopped talking. They have this incredible presence, and they constantly on exhibition as living sculptures.
And they'll come here in February?
And hopefully. They're absolutely hypnotic. You know, I had lots of friends who say, oh, this isn't art, this is ridiculous. I'll come and watch it just for 5 minutes to make sure that it isn't art. And after 3 hours, they were still sitting there. It was absolutely hypnotic. And one of the things that I can say I'm proud of is the artists that we have picked in the 70s, who were just at the start of their career, have all gone down in history as being really old masters of contemporary art. And they've all been to Australia, and they've all done work in Australia, which is very pleasing.
Just a footnote, incidentally, for those of you under 60, the Flanagan and Allen song that they're miming to they're a comedy partnership in the Depression and during the war, and along with Vera Lynn, you know, this was what people were listening to during the Blitz underground in London, and George and I suppose, are much of the same generation, growing up in London, Nick too. They were always getting airtime on the radio still. I mean, you know, we hadn't got the Beatles yet, but we had by '69. Yeah. But really, you know, it was that generation growing up, and it was a kind of revered thing. So it was this was the great British spirit, and they were doing something odd to it. And I think everything they do with their photo works and everything else is kind of, it's not exactly sending up Britishness and the public school system, but it is. Anyway, Meralda came next. Some of you might remember the press in I think it was when
After Gilbert and George they came.
Yeah, but I mean Meralda was probably more recently famous when the Columbus married the Statue of Liberty in New York, and there was this enormous costume done in the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center, big enough for the bridal gown for the Statue of Liberty, and this enormous wedding ring, and Columbus came and married. But when he came to Sydney, he made a feast, which is what he was better known for at that time. We have some of this in the gallery because we found a crate which we thought might have something to do with Meralda, and it had been sitting in the basement for 30 years. And it was kind of fun because when we prized the lid off, there was this ghastly smell and sort of crumbling, and it was the rubber seal on the crate had completely disintegrated. But the bread was just fine. Seriously toxic stuff, I suspect. So it was a very big installation in the entrance court. We only have a table load, a small table load now. One of the more challenging and extraordinary conjunctions, Charlotte Moorman and Nam June Paik in '76. Oh, yeah. John's pointing out we're being slow. Well, it's not me.
All right, I'll be quick.
But you know, just look at what Nam June Paik, of course, worked with Beuys and the Fluxus movement, worked often with Charlotte Moorman, who worked with the cello. Again, this is a thing. I don't think we'd be able to send a rather plump lady with a cello over the Opera House suspended on a bunch of balloons today. You might not want to. But it was, I mean, it's very ambitious and very spectacular thing to do. And of course, Paik has another connection because other artists, like Bill Viola, was an assistant in Paik's studio. Paik virtually invented video installation. And then Vitello is also a young artist you're looking at for one of the next projects.
That's right, and he helped Paik in his later years. But what is interesting is that Paik came from music. He was a trained musician, and he changed from music to video art. Bill Viola was involved with music before he became a video artist, And so is Stephen Vitello, a young American sound artist who now mixes sound with lights, etc. They all started with music first. So it's an interesting connection that leading video artist came from sound, from music.
So the TV cello and the TV Buddha are two works that are in the show which are coming into the collection, courtesy of John. And if you think about Bill Viola's earlier works in particular, but the whole strategy of his work, there is this kind of looping, the self-regard of the video. And here you've got the Buddha looking at himself on the monitor in real time being photographed by the camera. So it's that kind of classic conceptual loop that provides the logic for so much video art after that.
Also, what I liked about Nam June Paik then is that while it was video-based, it was very sculptural, whether you had the TV cello or the TV bra, the TV garden, the Buddha watching itself in the TV. It wasn't just straight video, it was video used as sculpture.
So the next one is Sol LeWitt in 77, and he did major murals at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which is a very conceptual and very rigorous minimalist wall installation in Sydney, and a rather more colourful one in Melbourne. That's what it used to look like down at St Kilda Road, with that peculiar grid in the ceiling. So do you want to say anything? Sol LeWitt, I know. We come back to Sol LeWitt, actually, don't we?
Okay, yeah, let's come back to Sol LeWitt.
Richard Long in 77, who did walks in the Australian bush, brought stone in and made, this is in the entrance court of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. That we will use in May 2011. It's designed for the entrance court, and that's where it should be. Gets in the way of parties, though. But here's, we've got photographs of the walk and images of the kinds of things he did out on the walk, left in the landscape.
And we don't know where he did it. He got onto a train in Sydney towards Broken Hill. He got off somewhere where he liked the landscape and did the work in situ. And he photographed it, and that's the only record we have of it.
So people in London have been seeing it as part of his big retrospective. That was in Melbourne. Unlike the Sydney ones, Melbourne tossed it out after the show, which is a great shame because it's a major piece. The next one is a reversal, back to sending Australia to the world. And this was at a time we couldn't get any interest from the Australia Council, even though I was chair of the exhibitions committee at the time, I think. I was really pissed off, actually, because, I mean, John's idea was a really good one, but the Australia Council wanted to do a kind of, a committee show which had a bit of everything in it, which they did. But this one that went to PS1 actually, I think, had much more impact. And frankly, committees never really quite score. You know, it's somebody working closely with artists that they absolutely trust and admire can pull something off. And this was first at PS1, which of course is now a branch of MoMA, and it was so successful that the Corcoran in Washington asked to transfer it down there. So all the works were works that could be sent relatively easily. Imants, of course, boxes full of canvas boards. Mike Parr was doing these very large drawings at that time. This one's in our collection. We've also got a large Tillers in the collection from that same show. And Ken Unsworth has always done drawings, but for this show he did very large-scale drawings that relate to his performances and so on. So it was very successful, and again, connecting Australia with the world. Then John suggested to the Art Gallery that we bring John Claude and Christo back for a major retrospective, and I think it's probably the most important retrospective we ever did. We had works going back to the late 50s, relating to his street blockages in Paris, and again in '68, major maquettes and collages and photographs and murals. It was a very, very major retrospective. And in the entrance court, he wrapped the vestibule and the founding fathers, and we made a multiple from that, which you'll see in the show. Next, Jeff Koons. John, tell the Jeff Koons story.
In a way, it was, how it started was similar to Christo, because Jeff built the first puppy near Kassel at the time of a documenta, and I've only seen photograph of it, like Christo's sausage 30 years before that at Kassel. But the photograph struck me, and I thought that's a great work, would be wonderful to do it in Australia. The one in Germany didn't survive because it was made out of wood, and towards the end it basically had to be destroyed. I went to see Anthony Doffey, who was the Jeff Koons gallerist, and he said, John, as a friend, don't touch it. I spent millions trying to build it properly, and it just won't work, and don't get involved with it. I said, but I like to try. So he said, well, here is Jeff Koons' address, phone number, go and see him next year in New York, which I did. And basically Jeff told me the same story. Too difficult. I tried afterwards with a foundry in New York. I spent several $100,000 of my money. Just impossible. And I said, well, let's see what we can do. And we got a scale model, a little white terrier, about a meter high or less. And we were fortunate that I met in Sydney Doug Knox, an engineer, who, with computers, dissected this model into about 10 centimeter sections. Can you see it there? It's sort of, no, the sections, can you go back? Like that one over there, horizontally and vertically, and then he blew it up to 3-story high, which was the puppy meant to be. And we built it like a large logo set, like a large Meccano set that got screwed together in layers of about a meter high. And it took about 9 months to do, and it worked just beautifully. There was a full irrigation system inside with a ladder. It was a bit like a Trojan horse. And Jeff Koons only came a few days before it was finished to put the final touches on the face and the nose. And we actually registered Puppy at the town hall as Sydney Puppy and gave him the registration as a souvenir. And it was a memorable piece because I think it's a great sculpture, but at the same time it made everybody smile. Now, art doesn't have to make one happy. There are a lot of emotions that art can raise, but this one just made everybody smile, which was a wonderful experience. There's just a quick funny story. A few days after Jeff left, I was at the MCA looking down at the puppy from the top floor, and there was this plant growing out between the puppy's ears. And I asked one of the attendants, what's that? And he said, John, you don't want to know. I said, come on, I need to know. What is it? I said, no, John. He said, well, what is it? Well, apparently, one of the students planted a marijuana plant. And it was growing very well, very prominently. And I thought that was quite amusing. So when I was speaking to Jeff later that day, I just told him what happened. He got terribly upset. He said the puppy is about innocence, about love, about purity. No, he was dead serious. He was absolutely serious. And he insisted to have it removed straight away. I said, Jeff, I can't remove it straight away. I need to get a cherry picker. It's 3 stories high to get it taken off. You know, it took me about a day to organize it. I think he rang me up about a dozen times. Has the plant been taken away? Has the plant been taken away? And he wouldn't leave me alone till I told him it's gone. And that really gives you an insight how artists think, how Jeff was thinking. That to him, the puppy really symbolized innocence, love, purity. And he wasn't just putting it on. It's a really interesting insight.
He was in full-scale recovery from Cicciolino.
Well, yes. That wasn't that innocent.
John formed a really strong attachment with Sol LeWitt, I think, and wanted to bring Sol LeWitt back. And Sol was a very, I mean, apart from being the person who wrote the manifesto for conceptual art, and very important in many ways, was also a lovely guy, I think.
I believe Sol is one of the most important artists of the second half of the 20th century, as he invented, discovered, how would you put it, Tony?
I said wrote the manifesto.
All right, he wrote the manifesto, and his body of work is incredible. He did drawings, sculptures, writing, and he worked literally till he died. And he was suffering from cancer for 6-7 years, and he worked to the very, very end of his career. And what was so wonderful about him is that the last probably 10 years of his life, he absolutely blossomed into this very strong, very graphic, either black and white or black on black or very brightly colored. He still calls them drawings, but they really are wall paintings. And he was full of life to the very end and very generous to young artists. He used to exchange works with them, encourage them. There's, again, just a story to illustrate how he worked. There was an opening of a large sculpture of his at a gallery in New York. And I was going to the opening, and I met Sol a block before the gallery, and I said to him, "Oh, Sol, I'm looking forward to see your sculpture." And he said, "So am I." And I said, "What, you haven't seen it yet?" He said, "No, I gave the instructions for it." And that's how conceptual and many minimal artists worked. For them, the idea and the plan was really the art. The execution was done by assistants.
Well, Vanessa Beecroft. I asked John why Vanessa Beecroft, but...
Does it need explanation?
No, all right.
No, but quite seriously, while the obvious comes to your mind, to see the figures over a certain amount of time, their movement, their poses, becomes quite classical, quite sculptural. I mean, very different to Gilbert and George, but the work was better than the individual people and their movement. It came together.
It's interesting, in the archival table in the middle of the show, there's something I hadn't seen before, instructions which are quite prescriptive about how people move. Yeah. Rondinoni, who is a real gadfly, he moves, he has no specific style. It's very hard to, I think, to place him, but everything he does with enormous verve and panache and skill. Much of this is, in fact, what you see in front of you now is in John's collection, coming to the gallery, make a big impact there. This is sitting in the corner in the show, very close to Vanessa Beecroft. I thought that was rather nice, actually. Anyway. But he works cross-media with film and sculpture, and there's some very large drawings in the collection. I mean, they're like 2.5 meter wide drawings derived from Dutch landscape etchings. Big sculptural, gestalt sculpture like after Robert Morris or something done down at Acker. Very diverse. Barry Mcgee, a surfy boy, who does the most fabulous prints, small, delicate, beautiful paper, and great piles of junk with equal verve. And this was done in the meatworks in Melbourne. And we've got some of these bottles from the middle there, just as a sort of token for the show of this installation. I gather the boys were having a good party time in Melbourne.
It's really interesting. He came out of the skating world, and as soon as he arrived to Melbourne, it was like an underground drum system that all these skaters and graffiti guys turned up at the meatworks, and we almost had to have guards because they all wanted to talk to him, all wanted to distract him, and all I wanted for him to get on and do the project. And he's a lovely guy, but to discipline, and the project got done in time and it was really monumental, but they insisted on going surfing every morning, and in Melbourne you have to drive a long way for a surf beach, so they wouldn't turn up till midday, whether somebody wanted to interview them or somebody else came, not before midday, but then they worked till midnight. And it was, as I say, a monumental project.
So, Urs Fischer, I just say this about John again, that the Biennale of Sydney had been looking at Cockatoo Island for some time. I was desperately keen that it should go there, but up until this time, it all been just too difficult. But John went there in 2007, and of course, subsequently, the Biennale has gone there. I mean, it was crazy not to go straight away, because we always ask ourselves what is the most, what is going to distinguish the Sydney Biennale from any other. And frankly, it's got to be as good a Biennale as you can do. And you can't, there's no curatorial strategy to make it different. It's just going to be as good as the individual curator can make it. But we do it on the harbour. That's what Sydney's got. Anyway, so John pioneered that with Urs Fischer, who made work here and brought some work with him. Again, we've got a fragment of that installation just as a reminder in the exhibition. Gregor Schneider, my favourite artist in the entire world. I didn't expect to see him doing a project in Sydney, or on a beach for that matter. I'm used to him in dungeons, really, or in old terraced houses in London. But this piece, on the one hand, it captures that whole dark narrative of the Pacific solution and so on. It also relates to a work called Volta Weisse, which he did in Düsseldorf, relating to Guantanamo, and yet it's an open cage on a beach with lilas and umbrellas. So it was a work which people readily engaged with in Sydney. You can see them moving in. But as John said, it's actually also very...
Sorry, Tony. Look at that image, because... Sorry. Look at that image, because what I loved about Gregor's work is that it affected you on so many different levels. Like here, it was like a minimal sculpture. Then again, when people were in it, it took on a completely different dimension. And when you were inside one of these cells, if you were looking through the cells to the beach, to the other people, it broke up the scene completely, became almost like a pointless painting. So it was really absolutely multi-dimensional, a very strong work.
And as John said, that went on to Tel Aviv, where people didn't see it the same way at all and didn't want to go in it for all the kind of reasons you can imagine.
Just one of the things about projects which I find great fun. I was there a lot of the time because I loved it. And I was just standing on the broad walk at Bondi Beach, and a young man, roller skates, came by, said to me, "What's this shit, mate?" And I said, "This shit is a work of art." He said, "No, mate, I'm an artist. I know what art is." So I said to him, look, very sorry, I didn't know you were an artist, you must be right. And off he went happily.
So Bill Viola in a church, a Romanesque church, St Saviour's in Redfern. I had no idea it was there. It was David Malouf who...
Don't you go every Sunday?
Not really, John. Not since I was 13. No. But it was a fabulous site, and we did a complementary project at the Art Gallery. But this was part of the work that was St Saviour's. You've got Tristan being called back up from the deathbed by Isolde, and you've got the figure plunging into the fire, but it turns out it's not the fire, it's actually the fire reflected in the water. Extraordinary image. Martin Boyce down in Melbourne, who went on then to represent Scotland this year in Venice. Subsequently, we've got, again, fragments from this installation as a reminder. Through the middle of the exhibition, we've got this kind of material on a long, long table. And at each end of the table, there's a web hub, which will be working one day. I've actually seen, it does work. One of the computers has been working, but not quite as I'd like it to be. But that will, I mean, you can go from home onto the web and look it up anyway. Once it's fully operational, it's an enormous amount of information. But people are actually gathering around the table and looking at the fragments. You can see a piece of the cloth and the rope from Christo and so on. Outside the gallery, we have Tatsu Nishi, which you just have to go and see for yourself. This is an earlier work that both John and I saw separately in Liverpool in 2009. No, it was in 2001. I did the Biennale in 2001, where he boxed in Queen Victoria, who's underneath that cupola with the angel, the avenging angel on top, and all around the bottom there were these sort of colonials in chains. And he actually boxed off the bit around the colonnade for the Queen and built a hotel room, toilet and shower. And the Biennale of Liverpool actually rented the room out, spent the night with Queen Vic, and it was fully booked. And the only thing that was odd about the hotel room is there's a bloody great statue of Queen Victoria standing in the middle of it. And he's done something to Bay's sculptures of War and Peace outside the gallery, which nobody's looked at for such a long time, they just walk past. But now you're allowed to go up and you will see them in a very different way, I promise you. But I'll leave that there.
What was the very first moment of inspiration that took you on this path?
What do you mean?
In terms of your interest, I mean, you could have been interested in many other fields. It's art, it's provocation, it's all
Well,
those things you discussed. How did it actually, where did it come from? Where did it begin?
Okay. Working backwards, I started to collect art in my early 20s. And I first collected artists of my generation like John Olson or Fred Williams. I mean, little watercolors or things that I could afford. I was employed as a designer, fabric designer. And then I started to travel on business, and that's when pop art came up. And I just thought that's incredible. Andy Warhol, Lichtenstein, Robert Indiana, all the first Rosenquist, all the early pop artists, it just exploded. And works from those artists were cheaper than a John Olson or a Fred Williams, considerably cheaper, small works. So I started to collect. And that was in the early 60s. And then, seeing what was happening in Australia, I saw, again, 60s, Australia was very isolated. And because I was passionate and am passionate about art, I thought, no, collecting isn't enough. I want to share my love with the Australian artist, Australian public, in just bringing to Australia what is happening. So that's how really the project started. That was the, to me, collecting is something very personal and private, and projects are for the public. That's the difference. Does that answer your question? No? Yes? No?
It's a good start.
Oh, okay. Yes.
I must say, I was an art student in Melbourne.
Yes.
When Christo came out here, and a friend and I hitchhiked.
Looking at you, I don't believe it.
A friend and I hitchhiked from Melbourne to Sydney and got a lift with this crazed truck driver who I'm sure was drugged out of his mind. It was really frightening. Got to Sydney for the very first time and went to see the work, and it was just so inspiring. It was extraordinary. I would love to convey the scale of the work. We wandered up and we were just blown away, and it was in progress. It hadn't been completed yet. And we were given the task of sewing the
Oh, good, thank you.
together. Yeah. And so, you know, when you see the photographs of the piece, you don't realise what labour went into actually putting the thing together. There were teams of people sewing. I think the Mountaineering Club from
Yes.
Sydney Uni.
Blue Mountains, from the Blue Mountains, yes.
Oh, was it from the
From Blue Mountains, yes.
They were, you know, doing the climbing and trussing.
No, you're absolutely right. You know, when we were looking for a site for Gregor in 2007, I went to look at Little Bay, which is very different now, because then it was, most of it was just a rubbish dump, the back of it. And now,
I've got a question about that.
and now it's very cultivated. But I looked at those cliffs and I thought, John, you must have been out of your mind.
I'm not sure whether it's an urban myth or not, but did it catch fire from
No,
the fire?
no, no, no,
Okay.
never.
Yeah, because I heard...
No,
it was-
no, no, no.
Right, okay.
Although John tells us that when they arrived, the Garbos were sort of doing their stuff, and said, what's all this then? It's sort of wrapping and so on. But, you know, but by the next day, Christo and John and Claude apparently persuaded them, and they actually...
They were
stopped
big
the
help,
gardens,
yes.
and they were
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, fantastic.
yes.
Like Benita, an older, I actually took a class from their Sydney out that day, knowing I was going to be overwhelmed, but I hadn't realised, like Benita, how overwhelmed I was going to be. And my 3-hour class, which I took out on public transport, was supposed to go back. Most of them stayed. I had to go back, but they all stayed there and sat and sewed, because that was the impact on art students at that time.
Hmm.
Today, I live in the local community, ran the council. I'm amazed at the neglect that the local council actually, they don't realise what a masterpiece they have there, because still it is not appreciated. And I've made it my job to try and change that if possible.
Thank you. Thank you.
I realise that the ABC book of the 501 greatest artists of all time, we've got Leonardo or whatever, we have Christo, and I noticed that his masterpiece is listed, The Little Bay.
Oh, great.
That was on a special recently, and I bought a lot and gave them all to everyone.
Thank you. Yes, Ian.
Seeing we're telling out, where were you when Christo? I was my first year out teaching, and it's not uninteresting in terms of Tony's comment about what impact it had in terms of Australian culture. I was teaching first year out Inverell, northwest New South Wales, a rural grazing town, not likely to be interested in contemporary art, but indeed if you hit the front page, and as the expert in art, being the first year our art teacher in high school, I was summoned to the Inverell Bowling Club to please explain.
That's a lovely story. Thank you, Ian. Anybody else?
Just a contrast question, John. I'm really aware of what a popular the event, the Little Bay Golf was, not just around the world. But how did you feel the New South Wales trustees' then reaction to Christo in 1969?
Well, that was interesting. That's
Sorry, I know.
that's very pointed question. Christo was asked to leave something behind for the art gallery. The art gallery had no money, but he decided to donate something. So we got him 2 gum trees, a bigger one and a shorter one, and he wrapped them on my front lawn. One he gave to me, the other, the longer one, which is probably from that desk to there, he was going to, or he wanted to donate to the art gallery. So it was delivered to the art gallery with great ceremony, was filmed by the ABC, and lo and behold, the next trustees meeting, it was rejected by the trustees as being too difficult to look after. So Peter Leverty, the then director, rang me up and said, well, what do you want to do with the tree? I had nowhere to store it, so I said, well, send it home. And for about 15 years, the tree would only fit down the corridor of my house, but the only way was to block off one door to one room, which you had to go through other rooms. And the tree lived happily with 5 kids and a dog. Nothing happened to him, and now it's going to end up at the art gallery finally. Actually, both
We
trees.
worked out how to look after it.
Yes. So the revenge of the gum trees.
At least we didn't throw it away.
No. Any question? Yes.
I was wondering, how do you choose like the next project you want to do? You mentioned the first project kind of happened by chance.
Yes.
So, like, for the other projects, how do you go about like deciding this is the one you want to choose? Like most of them, I mean, a few of them are really like impossible projects.
We like doing the impossible, but the way I choose, there's no much to the worry of people who work with me now. There's no, how shall I say, deep academic thought given to it. But the way we work is, again, going back to basics. Want to bring to Australia groundbreaking artists who do something which is important, which hasn't been seen here. And one thing leads to another. We also, since a couple of years, have an international advisory committee of leading curators in New York and in London who have contacts, who suggest artists. And it's, by now, I think the projects we do, the history of it, has a reputation. So if we approach an artist, we don't approach the artist cold, which helps. And usually we ask the artist to come on a site visit to explore several sites, Sydney, Melbourne, or other states, and then they propose what they would like to do, and then we see if we can make it happen.
I have to say that the new one, I mean, having written about it for the book, from the descriptions, from knowing exactly, having seen his work before, Tatsumishi, previously known as Tatsuro Bashi and other things, I made a point of not going to see it until it was finished. I'm very glad I did that, because knowing exactly, having described exactly what was going to happen and how astonishing it was going to be, I walked in to see War, and I was astonished. Now, it actually exceeded, expectations, and I think that's in John's project all along. Do things that can actually exceed what you could possibly imagine.
Well, that's the aim. That's really the aim. Because very early on, Christo said something to me which stuck in my mind, and it's in the front page of the book that Sophie edited. Christo said, to him a project is success when it exceeds his imagination. And that is so true. It was true then and it's true now. But one of the things which I think someone asked or we touched on, I think to me it's important that the project engage not only with art lovers, not only those who follow art, but with the public, whether it was with Christo or it was on Bondi Beach with Gregor Schneider or Martin Boyce, people walking along in Melbourne. It's the encounter of the public to bring a sense of wonder and amazement to people who don't normally look out, who encounter art. That is really, I think, what I like to aim for.
Talking about exceeding expectations, I mean, I think what the audience should know is this is all philanthropic. There's no corporation, there's no...
Absolutely not, no.
So just leading this one step further, you've also worked with high schools and I think also with infant schools.
Well, since 3 years, now this is interesting. I was the Australian Commissioner for Venice Biennale in 2005 and 2007. And I really enjoyed that because it was wonderful to do something for Australia. I love Venice, I love contemporary art, and if I can do something for Australia, I was really thrilled to be able to do it. And I think for both biennales we found very good artists. But I thought, wouldn't it be great, when my role is finished, to do something with art education so that the next generation of artists coming out of art schools could even be better. So I thought, what could we do for art education? And that was a few years ago now. We haven't really come up with a niche. Instead, we came up with a very successful project, which is Move Video Art in Schools, which is for high schools, and we're now over 1,400 high schools throughout Australia, which is like 2 million kids. We're also working on a new project for primary schools, and I very much want to do something for tertiary education, which was my original intention. And just before our talk, we were talking with Ian to explore the ideas, how can we find something? You see, we have a small organization with a limited budget. The only way we can do something important, if we find a niche, if we find a certain direction. And I would be very, very excited to explore that with COFA, through Ian, with the other teachers, with the students. How can we make a difference?
You mentioned before that you were working in design for Dunlop. I just wondered what your personal connection was to sculpture, seeing so much of your projects are really based around sculpture. That makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. No. I was trying to find the right way to answer, because a lot of what I do doesn't come from here, comes from here. It's a gut reaction. I always liked three-dimensional objects and sculpture. Why? I don't really know. But our first, if you like, projects were with Australian sculptors. In those days, there were a few art prizes in the 60s, no sculpture prize. And I like sculpture. There's no other explanation I can give you.
Yeah, just going back to your question about how this gentle, quietly spoken person is incredibly good at getting people to do stuff, galvanising their enthusiasm and energy. And I think that's
who are you talking
from the
about?
beginning. No, he is. I mean, it's not just that he's picked artists to do stuff. I mean, all of the projects only happen because he brings other people along with him. He's very good at that.
I mean, thank you, Tony, but what Tony says is so true. You can't do it on your own, and since a few years now, we have a small but outstanding organization. Sophie she was the editor, she's now our program manager, and it takes teamwork to get things done. And I mean, like with Urs Fischer on Cockatoo Island, he came out to look at it, and the cupboard which you saw there was meant to fit into one of the buildings. Well, he miscalculated by a couple of inches, and the cupboard wouldn't fit. So we had to manage to get a crane onto Cockatoo Island to lift something which was 1 ton. And, you know, each project has different challenges because they're in different locations, have to convince different people, and I suppose that's what makes the projects go around.
I have a tough question. The tough question.
Tough question.
The tough question is, why not Asia? You haven't.
Why not?
Why not Asia in terms of your selection of artists? Bashi.
He's Japanese. Bashi is Japanese, but Japanese wouldn't like to be called Asian. If you call a Japanese Asian,
Sorry.
Nam June Paik, but yeah. Okay. Not Chinese at the moment. I think the first lot of Chinese contemporary artists who came up in the early 90s, there were some very, very good ones. But lately, I would think the last 5-6 years, there has been so much contemporary art from China mass-produced. It's like when China in the 16th, 17th century was exporting porcelain to the West. It's just, some of it must be good, but there's so much bad that you can't, I don't think you can tell the good, or I can't. There's some interesting art coming out of India, some interesting art coming out of Thailand. New Zealand, I think they're interesting artists. No exclusion. Latin America, we're looking into doing projects with Latin American artists or Spanish artists living in Latin America. I think the Latin American scene is very interesting.
If I could comment on that, I tend to think that over the years, John's given us the art we've been hungriest for. And certainly at the very beginning. I mean, we were so, don't you remember how hungry we were for international art in the late 60s, early 70s? We were starving.
But that drove us all overseas.
Not all of us, some of us.
No, David Malouf and I went the same year, definitely.
But
Tremendous passion. I mean, that's the next step. You drove that
sorry, Ian, you raise a very good question because just yesterday I read an article by Hans Ulrich Oberst, who is one of the hot curators now. He's the co-director of the Serpentine in London. And he was making a point which is well known, that there's not one centre anymore. There are lots of centres. And I mean, it's interesting, I was thinking about that last night, and surely several thousand years there was Chinese art, Indian art, Latin American art, which was collected by Chinese or Indians or Latin Americans. But today we're in such a global world that everybody can collect from all over the world, and it's being sold all over the world from every corner. So yes, when I first got interested, New York became the center, then Germany, Italy, London, and now I don't think there is any one strong center. There may be strong centers for selling, but artists come from all over the world.
You seem to have a very good eye.
I beg your pardon?
You have a very good eye for the things that you've done, and at the show it seemed very cohesive, all the work together. And do you consider yourself a curator or an artist?
Not an artist. I don't know what I consider myself. People asked me that before. I think I'm not rigorous or academic enough to be a curator. I don't do enough research. I don't remember dates so well. I have to now refer to Sophie.
Maybe you're an artist?
I leave it for others to make up their mind what I am. I'm not sure.
Maybe art lover is the right word.
Yes, that's a good description.
Art lover is a much better word, covers everything.
Yes.
And probably we should say thank you here, and yeah, it's been wonderful. So thank you both of you.
Can I just say one thing which I think is important? Sorry, Joanna.
No, that's fine.
Is people ask me why contemporary art? And I say, no, you're wrong. I love art of all periods, whether it's Egyptian or Greek or Roman or Byzantine or Renaissance or Impressionist, Cubist. I think labels don't mean anything. To me, there's just great art and a lot of bad art. And that's throughout the ages. But the reason why I'm involved in contemporary art, because it's happening today. Because contemporary art is part of our environment, which we should understand the most. There's no way that we can really understand Renaissance art or Greek art or Egyptian art, because even experts can't quite make themselves at home in Venice in the 16th century or even Paris in the 19th century. The pressures, the living conditions, the economic, political, social conditions were so different. So we only can get a partial understanding, but we should be able to get a full understanding of contemporary issues. So that's why my interest is on contemporary art. But when I'm traveling, I go more to see classical art in a way, or just as much as contemporary art. And I think I want to emphasize that to you who are students, that great art is throughout the ages and hopefully will continue. Thank you.